My company has a mission, and my company was formed in 1989, and the mission is to repair the fabric of communities. This is a picture of a building in the South Bronx in 1980. And this is the same building in 1982, and what we began to see, and this is the same building in 1984 and 1986. And so you had vast swatches of major parts of all American cities that were empty. This is an aerial photo of the area where the project was in 96. So look at how much empty land there is. Huge amounts of empty land. That empty land is 100% filled in today. It's hard to tell because it's an aerial photo, but there is a series of buildings here. Those are the last of the federally funded public housing project, affordable housing projects. They are gray concrete block. They are 20 feet tall. They look like a prison. They're astoundingly horrible places to live. And that's what, there had been a move in the public housing realm that was all about cost. And we're building just bigger and bigger projects that were cheaper and cheaper, and there are more and more warehouses for human beings, and they were horrible places to live, and they gave birth to horrible social behaviors. I mean, in every way, they were the way to misconstruct a community. So what you ended up having in the Bronx were existing buildings that were not good places to live, and some new construction, and then a lot of devastation in the private sector. Okay, so in all communities, what we saw, those communities, we saw the growth of extraordinary community development organizations of people who essentially were outlaws, who said, we will not go. They were often squatters. They were, in this area of the Bronx, a group called Los Cademos was formed. They were Hispanic, and they said, we're not only not going to go, we have a vision for our community, and we're not going to accept yours, the city, and we're going to plan it. And they put together one of the first community-based planning processes, a really serious planning process with a vision for the future of their community. And the vision included single-family buildings, multi-story buildings, et cetera, but also tall. But they had a vision of a diverse. So interestingly, we hear a lot about gentrification, and low-income people wanted the ability to stay in the communities that they were fighting for, but they also wanted those communities to improve. So what the issue about gentrification, they did not want the communities 100% gentrified, but they wanted their communities improved, and they wanted their communities to have diverse income diversity, and they wanted their communities to have great schools that attracted the kinds of families that cared about great schools. So that's the context. The community did a plan, and just a little interesting personal side note about the plan was that, so you're going to see Verde has in the center of it a 20-story building, and I was an advisor to the plan, and one day they called, and the Giuliani administration was not a friend to community-based planning, and the Giuliani was the mayor of New York at the time. And it happens that my cousin was the city planning commissioner, and one day the people called me up and they said, so there's a new plan for the South Bronx, and it only allows 6-story buildings or less. And they said, but we have a vision for a denser, richer, better community than that. And would you call your cousin? And I did, and he said, well, giving them the right to build, no community group's ever going to build a 20-story building. Those buildings will never exist in the South Bronx. So we think it's wasted zoning to give them zoning more than what the market's really going to build. And I said, oh, come on, just give it them. It's not wasted. He said, great. So, and what happened was that the community was right, and the Giuliani's administration was wrong. The community grew to be much more diverse. So here's what happened. So, there's one slide that was missing in this. So actually what got built on the site that I showed you, on this site, was were 2-story buildings. We're called New York City Partnership Housing. It's an affordable home ownership program. It's a very good program. It brought cops and firemen and people like that back to the Bronx and many other parts of the city. And we've seen these programs throughout. So in Chicago, for example, you saw that when Henry Horner Houses, a public housing project, was torn down, and the first things that were built were these home ownership units. But they're not good enough. And the reason they're not good enough is they're not dense enough. And cities need density to thrive. They need cities, density to support great school system, to great mass transit. You cannot have a subway system or the L or a light rail system function or BART without density. And so they were not dense enough. So Via Verde is here. Just a sec. Okay, so here it is. It's in the South Bronx. So you're seeing in the center of the slide Manhattan Central Park. So you can see it's not that far away. Just south of it is an area called the Hub, where there's a lot of mass transit and has been kind of the traditional shopping downtown of the Bronx. When I say just south of it, I mean just 4 blocks south. So here we're beginning. You can see every one of these little blue things is the subway line or a bus stop. You'll see the subway line and the bus stop. So it's and see the farthest left where it says the 2 and the 5, that's the Hub. So all the shopping you could need is there, or most of it, and the big red star in the middle is the location of Via Verde. So here we are coming into the site. So what happened was, at the time, the head of housing of New York City was Sean Donovan, now the Secretary of HUD, a very smart, forward-thinking guy. There was a very proactive New York chapter of the American Institute of Architects. The American Institute of Architects, in general, has not been a proactive force for public policy in America, but was a strong voice in New York. I don't know if we get to talk to everybody at some point, but I'd love to know from the other offices if your AIA chapters are at all a force in public policy for the things you're working on. A group called Enterprise Community Partners, whose board I am also on, an amazing national not-for-profit working to create green affordable housing and bringing about $1 billion a year of financing. So was NRDC part of this? I don't think NRDC was. So those 3 organizations got together and decided to create a design competition with this site for the next iteration of what green affordable housing would be. They called it New Housing New York, and they put out a competition, a global competition, asking for architecture developer teams to compete. And we put together a team with a wonderful local architect that we'd done work with named Richard Datner, and a global firm that had a New York office that I had a relationship with named Grimshaw, a very green global firm. So kind of high design and local design. And our company, for-profit, teamed up with Phipps Housing, a very wonderful, very long, one of the first affordable housing not-for-profits in America, over 100 years old, and the largest in New York. And so we formed an architecture developer team to respond to the RFP. This is what the site was. So interestingly, there's public housing to the left of it, an old high school there. There's actually a railroad cut that had been abandoned that runs through the side of the site. And as I mentioned, it was a very long north-south site. And so our initial thinking, so by the way, what was interesting is to look at the work of all the other competitors. About 35 people responded. They brought it down to 6 finalists, and then we won. It was very interesting to look at the work of the other submittals, because we came up with a strategy. I came up with this part of the strategy. By the way, the team is very much, the final product is a collaborative effort, and each of us contributed different things. But what I said is, it's a long north-south site. So the building should be taller in the north and shorter in the south so that we can maximize solar access. So that was, and then the other thing that we said is we want the floor plates to be thinner so that we can maximize cross ventilation. And our goal was really to focus on something called passive resilience. I don't know how, are people familiar with that phrase? So in our green, so we were really looking at, so my larger view is energy crisis is coming. There's going to be, not only is the burning of any energy burn creates climate change, but there are going to be, as you look at the growth of China, India, Brazil, etc., the growth of population and prosperity, we're going to outstrip our energy sources, and energy shortages are coming, and energy is going to be more expensive. And so every building, one of the reasons it needs to have a very low energy use is make it more resilient and survivable in those times when they come. Also, what we're going to see is with climate change, more weather disruptions and the likelihood of more power outages. So the idea of a building being passive resilient is that it can self-balance without external sources. So the way you get there, and so in Germany they have a standard called passive house. So you get there by more insulation, more cross ventilation, more natural daylighting, more insulation. You kind of get to a building that is self-balancing as possible. So the north-south thin fit into that strategy. And we really believed in also growing food, so we thought we would have as many green roofs as possible. So the first scheme was this one. So you see it's kind of going taller in the north and shorter in the south, and it's a series of kind of standard affordable housing buildings. So that was idea number one. And then idea number two is we said, let's connect these. We also were proposing not only a mix of incomes, but a mix of tenure types. So this project is about 2/3 rental, 1/3 co-ops and ownership. And so we began to say, let's put the rental in the high rise and create a courtyard or a kind of almost like a sub-community of these co-ops. And the co-ops are more focused towards live work. So this is a next idea. You're beginning to see the idea, which is a big theme of this, of the descending roofs and the lower rise piece. But in fact, what happens here is you have the disconnection between the courtyard you see in front and there's kind of a courtyard behind on the left. And the main street is the street you're looking at, you know, the view from, and you have this gap you're creating along the street. So then the next iteration was this. And this is kind of close to where we've ended up, but think of that as a massing, not actually the articulation of the building. And this is not the final scheme, but much closer to the final scheme. So you see a tall tower in the north and a series of roofs stepping down. And as it gets lower and lower, by the way, at the end, it leads into an amphitheater, and you can see one courtyard kind of tucked inside on the left and another one on the right. So here we are now in the final roof scheme, and then we really began to landscape and plan the roof. I have a theory that human nature and human culture, if you look at the way cities have been built from the Neolithic to now, we move from the most private spaces to public spaces. So we move from, if you think about like in the classic Arab town, you know, a very dense town in the Medinas, you'd have the family gathered around a very small courtyard, and then that court, which would be the private, and then there'd be a semi-private space, which could be an alley, and then a street that becomes more public, and then a town square that becomes the most public. So in all our projects, we try and do that moving from private to public. Here's a more articulated, and so where we really try to do is at the very top have a senior garden and meditation garden and yoga and exercise garden. It moved more and more into the public realm with actually community gardens, an orchard, and it ends in an amphitheater. So here's a rendering before the project was built for those that are in the room. You'll see, so here this family is looking down from the highest point. You see the roofs beginning to descend down, exercise roofs, etc. And then you get into the community garden plots here, the orchard, and then it's two orchards, and then you kind of get into the amphitheater that connects into the larger public space.
So from roof to roof?
Interestingly, in the original concept you could, but our not-for-profit property, partner in the end said it becomes unmanageable, and the management of a roof in a low-income community is a very serious issue, and so you do not go from roof to roof now, except the lower garden, orchards, and amphitheater you can. Here's a view from below. These are all renderings. I'm going to show you real pictures now because the project's almost complete. From the orchard, from the community garden, you see the orchard on the right and the rising roofs on the left. I'm going to show you two other interesting things. So normally in these kinds of projects, you put I'll say it here, but you put the health club or whatever, community facilities in the basement. But here we put it on the 7th floor. It's up here so that people really got daylight, and this is the recreation, the health club, and then there's the whole yoga meditation area outside. You'll also see in this original scheme that the solar was attached to the the southern facade of the buildings. That was the original concept. As we worked with our solar consultant, we then moved it, and the solar is now actually horizontal and forms sunshades throughout the project. So here's a scheme of how it's organized. On the far left is rental apartments. When you get to the middle, you're going to see this in more detail. The middle income co-ops move into a duplex live-work format, and then the townhouses. So let's go. This is, by the way, the kind of close-up of the facade. A lot of innovation in this building. One is we're using a rain screen facade. So the function of a facade in a building, the skin in a building, there's an aesthetics function. You want it to look good. There's a rain screen function. So in particularly higher buildings, rain is a real issue because it's wind blown. So when you have 70-mile-an-hour winds blowing, they can actually blow rain through bricks, etc. And so the ability, so by the way, typically in brick buildings, the way they're built is what's called cavity wall construction. There's the brick, there's a gap or the cavity, and then another layer inside, and the rain actually blows through the brick into the cavity and then drops down, and you have weep holes and it weeps out. So there's a whole system for how that works. So a facade has to have a rain screen, it has to have insulation, it has to have structure to help hold up the building, all those different things. This is a European system that we barely used in America before, in which the facade comes in with a panel, and that exterior layer's sole function is to be the rain screen, not to be insulation, not to be structure, and then those other functions take place in other ways in the facade. The roof also, there was a lot of design as to how you design the roof to be handicapped accessible. What height do we, how much can kids and families actually touch dirt and touch nature, which I think is really important. I mentioned that we created these duplexes, and so what's very interesting about them is, so where you see the big dots, that's the corridor. Then on the lower floor, so left and right, there is a living room, dining room, kitchen, work area below, and then you go upstairs, and above there are 2 bedrooms and baths. So the unit is a kind of an L, so it's got half the lower floor and the upper floor, and they interlock with each other. So it's very efficient because you eliminate a corridor every other floor, which improves a building's net to gross ratio, which means that for the same amount of material in terms of construction, you're getting more occupied area. So from an efficiency point of view, both real estate efficiency and material efficiency, you're increasing your efficiency. The other thing is, you can see with a blue arrow going in, which is cool air, and the red arrow going out on the right, you're getting cross ventilation through this scheme. We talked about the gardens. So here are just some of the qualities. So we're harvesting rainwater. We do this in all our projects. All the rainwater is harvested and then used for the watering of the plants, for the laundries and other functions. Energy, water efficiency, toilets and fixtures, Energy Star appliances, lighting. The cogeneration, combined heat and power for some. Heat recovery from exhaust air. So it's another thing we do in all our projects, is when you make really tight buildings, the air becomes unhealthy. So you have to circulate, and you get mold and stuff like that. You have to keep circulating air, but you do an air-to-air heat exchanger so you can reuse that heat. High efficiency condensing boilers, bi-level lighting. So bi-level lighting means in the corridors, when people are not there or the fire stairs, what we really like to do is have occupancy sensors and turn them off, but the building code requires us just to be able to turn half them off. Natural cross ventilation, roof gardens, passive and active recreation areas, on-site fitness centers, so a whole series of focuses on health. We leased almost all the ground floor to Montefiore for a local health clinic, so health is on site, and one of the things we're doing is a health assessment of every resident before they move into the building, and then a health tracking with the New York City Department of Health. So we're trying to prove that living in a green building improves people's health. The rest of the retail space is probably going to be leased to a Korean deli. Healthy interior materials, so no VOC, low VOC materials, active promotion of bicycle use, etc. Energy savings, so we think this building is going to save 37.3% over a baseline. Some of you know I've been very active in a program called Climate, Mind, and Behavior. And what we're learning is that, you know, you can make a base building very energy efficient. So for example, when you turn off all the lights in the corridors during the day when people aren't there, that's a savings. But more and more we are seeing that energy use is not in the building but in the people. So for example, if people turn their TV, you know, put their TV in their TV box on a power switch and turn it off and only when they left and only turn it on when they needed it, you'd see lower energy. So there's a whole behavioral side. I can give you lots of examples, but to the energy use of spaces. But so here you'll see kind of the different places that we got to our reduced energy use, and you'll see it's not one thing. Just like the wedges theory, you got to have in a building a series of wedges to get greener. So the building on the right, the building on the left is the rendering. The building on the right is actually how it really looks. And you can see more visibly on the right the sun shades. We're very big users, believers in these in passive sun shading. It's a really important device in kind of reducing energy load, particularly air conditioning load. So we're designing for future climate change. So not only today's temperatures, but future temperatures, low-income people. So what do we do? Maybe. No, it probably just needed to be like, yeah. Sorry. Okay, great. So that is reality. It actually looks better than the rendering, doesn't it?
Yeah. You should have asked people which one was the rendering and the real building.
Yeah, this is the real building. Partly because you can't see the detail in the rendering because it's such a big building. But this is an amazing looking building. And the so there's another point that actually I want to make, which I'll make now. So remember I showed you the Bronx, the image, and what I really need to show you is the image of the Bronx is entirely filled in now. I mean, all those empty lots have been built upon. A lot of it was very inexpensive, affordable buildings. Some of it's better, some of it's worse. But through continuous investment from the Koch, Dinkins, Giuliani, and Bloomberg administrations, so decades of investment in infrastructure, in schools, and in housing subsidies, a part of America that was lost and abandoned and burnt out and looked like Dresden is now a thriving, working class, affordable, middle income, mixed neighborhood, just as the community had envisioned it. It can only happen. And by the way, because it's denser, this building has zero parking. We had a parking requirement, we got rid of it. We got a mayoral override, and there's not a car in this building. It's entirely pedestrian and mass transit accessible. You can only do this with a dense rebuilding of urban communities. And so it's a combined social justice and environmental strategy, the rebuilding of creating dense, walkable communities. It will only happen with subsidy. The market cannot afford to do this. We believe that communities become stigmatized. And this building costs about, there were a couple things that drove up the cost. There's a brownfield cost that's related to it. But if you just look at the aesthetic cost and the combined aesthetic and green cost, it's about 7 to 9% of the total construction cost of this building. So what happens is America currently builds 100,000 units, subsidizes 100,000 units of affordable housing a year. So if we spent 10% more on every building, or if we spent 7% more on every building to make it like this, we would build 7,000 units of affordable housing less a year. And the affordable housing advocacy community says that is not acceptable. We're not willing to have more people be homeless or live in doubled up or in substandard housing just so you effete guys can have like better looking buildings. Well, the conclusion that I have come to is that I don't know whether it's 1 out of every 10 or 1 out of every 15 or what the number is, but that when you're rebuilding a community, there should be some key signature buildings that set a tone. I cannot tell you how proud the people of the South Bronx are that probably the greenest and most beautiful affordable housing, certainly built in America, maybe built in the world, but a very important building is in their neighborhood. I can't tell you how much pride and how much more value that brings to the mini blocks that have been rebuilt around this. So my point is, not every building should be this. I don't believe as a society, I'll rephrase this, as a society we can't afford it. But considering the fight we're having for limited resources for so many other things, the society is not going to provide the resources to do this in every building. But I do believe that it should be 1 out of every 10, or 1 out of enough to make really healthy communities of choice. And this is another issue. So something I'm very focused on is not just how do you make a green building, but how do you make a green community? And a green, affordable community, by community of choice, it's a place that when people move into, their lives and their families prosper, when their health prospers. So it's got better health care services, it's got better education, it's got mass transit, it's got access to jobs, it has parks and open space, it has diversity of housing, it has the ability that you can move up into it. What happens in a lot of low-income communities, there's another project I did that Kate has written about called Highland Garden Village in Denver, and it was in a market in which the most expensive house sold for $70,000. We built a new urbanist, dense urban infill, mixed income, mixed use community in which we were selling houses for $250,000 to $425,000. And everybody said, you're nuts. And what we said is, the reason housing of this value did, by the way, we also have affordable housing there too, but the reason of this housing in this neighborhood never sold at this price before is not because there weren't people willing to pay it or the incomes to pay it. It's because the housing was so crummy and the housing wasn't worth it. So part of creating a community of opportunity is you want, when people become doctors and lawyers and NRDC attorneys, you want them to continue to stay in the community. You don't want them to be forced out. So that's another reason why I believe we need to invest in them. So here you can see the building. So that was the close-up of this. You see this horizontal solar on the right. This is an actual interior. So this is one of the model apartments. Remember I showed you a duplex, so this is at the lower level, and there may be a stair. Oh, yeah, and there you can see like the stair leading up. So these are really nice places to live, actually, and I think that's a really critical part of revitalizing communities. So I'm going to end with this and open it up for questions and discussion.